What is going on, guys? Looks like I'm still waiting a little bit for Alex, but let's just get started here, shall we? Hopefully everyone's had a wonderful past 2 weeks. I think it's been a little bit since I've been doing a live, so hopefully everyone's enjoyed the last few weeks. Curious what everyone's up to, but so far, I think the one thing I was thinking about, because I posted this question, I think it was Saturday or Sunday, and I was like, who wins in a fight? and some people were like, it should have been data scientist versus data engineer. But I was honestly thinking about a question from the show We Crashed. I don't know if anyone's watched it, but I definitely enjoyed the show. Basically, my answer to the question personally was the person that owns the fight or is taking money off the fight, because I don't know. I feel like we always like to think about, things like the startups who are competing against each other and things of that nature. But the people who always end up winning are the banks or whoever actually owns the entire situation, and generally not the people who are actually playing. So that was kind of my thought there. Just my one single thought with that just more out of left field question. Let me check on Alex here. Let's see if he gave me any form of updates. He did not. Let me see if he is in Meet for some reason instead. I said nope. All right. Well, I guess it's just me for now. Yeah. Well, that's kind of the one thing I'm trying to think. I'm surprised how well my recent Databricks versus data engineering video did. Does anyone have any thoughts in terms of Databricks versus data engineering out there, or Databricks versus Snowflake out there? Any personal ones that you prefer? Maybe a different solution altogether. Maybe you're a Trino fan. In terms of how you set up your system, I'd love to hear kind of what your thoughts are in terms of like how do you process your data? How do you store it? I've seen a whole host of different ways. Again, like some people will just set up Trino and then set that up on top of like S3 or Iceberg, and then just pull a ton of data that way, run queries that way. But I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts in terms of how you've used these different solutions. Have I taken a look at Databricks SQL? A little bit. Obviously, it's kind of nice that there's at least something there. I don't know if it's like, I haven't tested it to be if it's as verbose as Snowflake SQL. And that's one reason I like a lot of what Snowflake does. And Presto has similar things in like Presto SQL in terms of the ability to like work with JSON really well and parse data. So I'm curious if Databricks provides that same functionality. I just haven't looked now that I think about it. So I'm curious if Databricks lets you. I imagine they must, otherwise it would be a big miss if they didn't, because that's kind of really nice to just be able to parse JSON in your SQL rather than having to write code to just parse some JSON that you could just store as objects. So I'd imagine they have to have that kind of set up. I'm still just kind of checking. It's like, hey, where's Alex? I think let me just make sure this meeting set today. Yep, it was. Okay. Well, let's see. So yeah, any other thoughts in terms of like the Databricks versus Snowflake discussion? Did anyone read the articles that Databricks and Snowflake kind of were throwing back and forth at each other in terms of like who's cheaper, Databricks or Snowflake? And Snowflake was over here complaining that you shouldn't be. I think they were the ones complaining you shouldn't be running TPC benchmarks on your own products, because that's just opens you up for a lot of different forms of conflict of interest if you're running your own kind of benchmarking, because you can kind of fine tune it. I did like that one statement they put in there where they're like, you can put in all these knobs and things of that nature to make things perform better on specific data sets. It's almost like was it Volkswagen when they like made it so that when you bring your car to the emissions test, it would like run differently. So I think that's the kind of concern, that you'd set up your Databricks or your SQL or your Snowflake in such a way that it would specifically operate really efficiently on that specific data set. So that was something that was also, I think, very fun, very interesting. It's nice when companies have maybe a combination of like humor plus like some hopefully healthy competition. I hope it's healthy. I think that's always good to have multiple products. And of course, they're not even the biggest winners currently. I assume Databricks is currently maybe at $1 billion ARR currently, and Snowflake is not even that much. It's not that much farther, honestly. So they're honestly pretty small in the world of data, right? Like you still have Redshift and all these other bigger solutions being used, probably making a ton more. So that's kind of where that's at. Again, I'm just continuously checking, like, yo, Alex, you said you'd be here. So just let me ping him on LinkedIn really quick. See where he's at. Dum, dum, dum. It might just be me and you guys today. We might just keep it open to some questions. I'm kind of like checking if he is somewhere else, but I don't see him. So yeah, it might just be me. Greetings from Argentina. Hello. Let's see which jam. I think the industry is moving towards lake houses and unified analytics platforms. So Synapse, Big Lake, Redshift, Databricks, Snowflake, all will be pretty much variations of the same platform. Yeah, I imagine there's going to be something there. I mean, I still I like the classic data warehouse for what it is, obviously, because it just makes, I think, things a little more concise and easy to understand. I feel like some solutions try to get rid of like the human element, which is like, data lake, just dump data here and we'll deal with it later. But you still end up dealing with the logic implementation layer at some point, right? Like you're going to have to do some integration or some sort of standardization, whether, today, because you've got a clear set data warehouse, or tomorrow because you've got a data lake and maybe you just haven't got to that data just yet. So you rarely avoid that human aspect. That's always the bottleneck, which is that, where you're actually implementing the logic. So that's usually the hard part. The easy part's honestly extracting the data and loading it into a table, then adding in that next layer of whatever your models are, and then from there adding in your aggregation and your metrics. That tends to be the harder part, I think, and the part that we're always kind of bumping up against, and we haven't really fully, I think, figured out. Regardless of what solution I feel like exists, it's always just another piece to try to make it easier, but not like auto model. There are tools that try to do like auto modeling, like doing like data vault. I think it's like Vault Speed might try to do that. But there's some solutions out there that try, but rarely have I seen one that really does a good job. You always have to go in and add in your human element to it. So that's my thoughts there. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm just gonna maybe give up on Alex showing up, or maybe his internet's out. Like Chad's was, but that's all good. You guys are here. I'm here. That's all that matters. I'm going to just check one more time. Yep, no, I sent him the right link. So yeah, like what questions does everyone have currently? I know like someone actually posted a comment recently asking me to do some questions in terms of like getting a job in data engineering, which I've done a few. I feel like I have a few videos on how to get jobs in data engineering. It's just always hard. It's not an easy space to fall into unless you are, software based. Okay, what's this question? What is this? Databricks analysis. I think my company is not yet at the stage where we look at these options, but really, yeah. Well, I'm glad you like the differences. Yeah. So Mike, I was hoping to have Alex. Alex is from People Data Labs, which they develop some APIs that basically implement models and different things of that nature. So I consider that a data product. So I wanted to have him come in and talk about what a data product is. He hasn't reached out to me or jumped on the link, so I'm not sure where he's at. Yeah, I would love to talk about it, obviously, but I can talk about some data products. The best data product I think I've put together. I mean, I say best. The only data product type thing I've ever put together. Personally, I worked at a company that did healthcare analytics, and basically we took data from claims. So if anyone's worked with claims data, you might be familiar. So we take that from like 40 or 50 healthcare providers, and we created like some basic models to kind of detect fraud, and then essentially sell those back to insurance providers to help them kind of know maybe which. This was more focused on providers. So providers are typically like healthcare providers, so like a doctor, and detect they were producing fraud. This wasn't patient-based fraud because in general for insurance companies, that's not as much. There's not as much money to like get from patient fraud unless it's like huge. getting an individual patient to kind of pay back for fraud is small. But if you can find large trends where maybe a specific provider, like a healthcare provider, is submitting claims that are fraudulent, that can be majorly impactful. You're talking about 5-6 figures, maybe. I mean, we were doing pretty small. So 5-6 figures is probably what it would be in per provider, maybe more, maybe less. In some cases, it involved like changing policy because they noticed that there were just trends where maybe it wasn't really worth for them to adjudicate, which just means to kind of fight those claims and say, like, hey, these claims are fraudulent, because it'd be like a $20 claim, but they'd be putting in thousands of these $20 claims. But yeah, so that has its own interesting factors in terms of like the people factor, right? Like you can build this model, sell it back to the insurance providers, and kind of have this data product, again, in this case, kind of in the form of like just a model that was detecting things. There's other things that we developed, like dashboards that we would sell back to insurance providers as well, or to like actual companies. So like a big Fortune 500 company might want to know how the health of their people is. So they like, you can actually, fun fact, HIPAA does allow you to send healthcare claims data to third-party analytics providers. So if you work in the US, your data can, like, you might not know your data is being analyzed by a company like that I worked at, but it can be. And then they'll just like send it back to your company that signed up for this service in usually an aggregate format. There's always the fight to make sure you're not sending some clear, single person in a department or something. So that's kind of the data products I worked on. Some was like models, some were more just dashboards that we then sold back to insurance providers. Let's see if this, I hate when this happens. My camera decides to just, let's see, get foggy and clear. Okay. So that's kind of the work I did for some data products. Not data as a product here. It's like literally taking data and trying to make it valuable. Like that company, all we did, like that's what we did. We just took other people's data and built something off of it and then resold it back to them, essentially. Or we had kind of like pre-made packages, essentially. Let me see if I can fix my camera by turning it off and on again. Sometimes that usually helps. Let me just turning off my camera here to try to like here we go. Whenever it gets foggy, for some reason it like loses focus. Yeah, I'm just at this point gonna assume Alex isn't showing up. I feel like I pinged him right before this conversation, and now yeah. Oh, hey, there he is. Never mind. I spoke too soon. Hey, how are you doing, Alex?
Good. How are you?
Good. Just want to make sure this is still a good time, right?
Apologies for the delay. We were in a meeting. We were just so in it. I was like, oh, shoot. I'm like 15 minutes late.
It's all good. I've just been kind of conversing, talking the little data products that I've done, and then, just going from there. Anyways, thanks for joining. Hopefully you're having a wonderful evening.
Yeah, it's great. Hopefully you guys are too.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, like Alex, I kind of gave a little bit of rundown, but you want to give a quick background on yourself, kind of what you do at People Data Labs?
Yeah, I'm the CTO here at People Data Labs. Since we sell data, it's our primary product. I work with our engineering team to help, acquire, integrate, build data products, and then find different ways that deliver them to our customers that kind of meet how they want to integrate data into their business.
Nice. And then just because I always like to make sure I ask this, like, what do you do when you're not working?
Yeah, so I love dancing. I live in San Francisco, and I recently found a dance class is like in-person things over Zoom, taught by an actually pretty well-renowned drag queen here. It's a fantastic class. That's like, it blows my mind. I used to teach aerobics when I was much younger, and I love going to Zumba. And so dance is like a big part of how I, get some stress out, do some other fun things.
Nice. Well, that's always a good way to make sure you're moving, especially when we just have such sedentary jobs. How did you get kind of into data? I guess, like, what was kind of your entrance into it?
Yeah, I knew when I was in college, like just going through computer science, that I was never going to be a front end person. It's like overwhelming. I'm not really good with colors, even like decorating my own house. I'm not like the best at kind of doing layout or things like that. Obviously, I enjoyed computer science quite a bit. And, my first job, I was working on an analytics engine for a BI tool. So someone else was writing queries. We had a query language we provided. And we used Lisp, which is very uncommon, to write programs that wrote programs that I would dynamically compile queries at runtime using like the customer's business logic and looking at the different data layout across many databases. And even though I wasn't at that time, like kind of the big data space hadn't totally yet started, seeing the kinds of problems people were solving with data, seeing how it's like we were a tool for sales and service performance management, which meant people were like being fired and rewarded like based on our calculations, right? So like the stakes were kind of high. It really mattered to do it well, be very rigorous. And that kind of brought me into the space and kind of feeling the importance of how data and information is used and how it can really impact people.
Yeah, that's actually pretty cool. Like in terms of like you're building like a query engine. I feel like I've been trying to write. I keep having like this article pinned to like write something about like query engine like processing, like what happens when you actually run a query. Just from a SQL standpoint, but I imagine getting even lower level, that's got to be kind of interesting. And writing in Lisp as well. It's like, wait, what?
So much easier. Everything else is so tedious.
Yes. So now, like looking at kind of the world as it is, how do you recommend people kind of get their first jobs in data these days?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So when I was in school, there was no like data science degree. There was not these programs like oriented towards data engineering. It's kind of come of late. And a lot of folks that I've met in data engineering through the years of just managing and hiring people, you find people coming from IT backgrounds, from data analyst backgrounds, from, they thought they were going to be a data scientist. They always end up in data engineering. It's pretty hard to find a job in tech that doesn't touch data in some way. And so if you're coming in as a software engineer, it might be raising your hand at work when someone's like, how do we get this stuff calculated? I'll go figure it out, right? Or like we're having trouble with the database. Or it's like there's so many paths in a data engineering that there isn't this like very standard way. So I guess if you're going out and looking for a job, I might just find a job as a software engineer if you can. You will probably find your way into it, but any of those positions often will lead there because that's just where businesses are struggling nowadays.
Yeah. What skills do you think kind of helped you stand out personally in your career?
Yeah, I think there's probably two, just in terms of like data engineering. One is being, it's going to sound so cliche, but like data is a reflection of the activities that we're doing, right? Like at the end of the day, what is data? I did this in a presentation once. Like I went out to a non-technical part of a company I was working for. It was in New York, and they're like, we're supposed to come and talk about data engineering and what it is. And someone in the audience, as I was going in this presentation, raised their hand like, what is data? Like, how do I know? Like, how do I think about it just like a lay person? And like, I think writing something down in a notebook, right? You're running an experiment, you're logging an entry, right? Being able to take something abstract like data and start relating it back to people in a way that is tangible to correspond to either an event that's happening in their lives, something that they can imagine doing, or something that they can imagine a machine is doing, so that like it becomes really tangible to them, really helps connect people when you're talking about and like, why is my report wrong? And they don't understand all of the pieces of information they're feeding into it, and being able to kind of translate and speak to data itself and how it relates to them is a really key skill that like the best data engineers can go beyond the code or the system or like all the fun algorithmic complexity and really distill it down for people and help them connect and understand to what the problem is.
Yeah. Sorry. So I mean, no,
that was one thing, but I don't know. If
no. I think that's valuable because I think the next thing that I always kind of talk about, or not always, I personally think in my head a lot, is when you grow in a data career, it's really easy to get behind like all of these like technologies and start learning things and adding maybe certifications or something and thinking like this is how I improve. But I think you're kind of covering it's like that's like you hit a point. I feel like with technical skills, and then you kind of have to like shift over into like, okay, now how do I actually grow in this career? And I think you're kind of outlining it's like, okay, now how do you distill this information to other people?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and so I mean, really, the big reason I kind of wanted to talk to you is because you guys kind of take data and make it more of a product, right? Like I think for some people, for many of us, when we work with data, we get to like build internal solutions, like dashboards. Maybe some of us build models, things of that nature. But how does like selling a data product as a kind of a service differ from creating some of these like internal data products, so to speak?
Yeah, I think what's really fascinating is like immediately there's this like big shift in the dynamic in your role as a data engineer. In most companies, I've been a data engineer in a lot of different companies. Typically, you're a means to an end. So at the end of the day, some mobile app or some, backend system is generating all these events. They all need to go somewhere so that people can get a holistic view of their business. And your job is to pull all that data together, make it so that people can navigate it, and then start asking questions to answer business problems, right? When the data is now the product that the company is selling for revenue, not a product or service, not a mobile app, not something that's like not the data, but actually the data itself. Now, instead of feeling kind of like beholden to what is going on by these other things that are a little bit out of your control, you're now the person that's in like kind of the command seat. You're the star of the show, right? Like now the product, all the focus on product is what are the problems that our customers are having? What is the data or information they need that would help them move forward more quickly? Or what are the tools they're trying to build where if we can already gather that data and serve it to them in a platform that's easy for them to integrate into their application, like we'll be a hero for them. And I think it kind of changes the whole dynamic of like how you fit into the organization, even though fundamentally the work is the same. We have a lot of sources that are all dirty in some way, through all the same data cleaning, standardization, normalization, bringing it all together. And we're still then saying, okay, what are the questions that you're asking? How do we best render or make that data available to you so that you can most simply answer your question? That part, the same, right? It's just the question is now, are you a means to an end or the ends to the means? And I think that's where there's a big shift that I've really enjoyed in being at a data first, a data product company, as opposed to just doing data engineering work to support a larger effort.
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense. I was talking about this before you came on, but like, I worked at like a healthcare company where that's kind of what we did. We like sold back information, and it's interesting because like I think about it now. It's like sometimes you build a dashboard and it kind of goes away, right? Like you build one dashboard, it disappears, or you build a model and like it doesn't get used the way or ever. And you realize that can't happen when you're building like data. Like that cannot happen because we get paid, and if they stop using this, they're going to stop paying for it. So
well, it's funny because like both at One Kings Lane when I worked there and at Uber, we kept user metrics on all of our tables. We saw how many queries were hitting every table, how many queries were hitting every column, because like the cost of processing, maintaining data that people aren't using is super high too, right? Like that's more jobs that fail that you have to be woken up to fix. That's more like storage costs or processing costs. And so, like actually knowing that people are using your product matters a lot, even if it's an internal data engineering role.
Yeah. No, I think, but do you feel like that's something that's maybe limited to big tech companies? Because I feel like smaller, like I think I the first time I ever saw something similar to that was Amazon, like, and I was just like interviewing at Amazon like 3 or 4 years ago. And like, we're just now trying to implement basically what you just said, like trying to track who's actually using this pipeline and table. Like, it doesn't feel like it was added until maybe the last half.
I think productizing it, is like, it's something that's a bit newer. Like when I was working at One Kings Lane, it was 2013, 2014, like in that time frame. And for us, it came down to like just getting the query logs from the database and just running them through a simple ETL to say, what are you selecting, right? Getting the columns out. There's lots of open source query parsers just to extract the column and table names.
Yeah.
And then from there, we used Tableau to make a dashboard. Like we didn't no one's over engineering this. We were just trying to keep it simple.
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense. I think the other interesting thing there is on top of like building this thing that works functionally, right? Like I assume now you kind of like data quality becomes far more important, right? Like you can't just like get away with like a quick Slack message that's like, hey, this looks wrong. Like you need to kind of avoid those situations very, very early. Like how do you guys set that up to make sure like that everything you're pushing through the system is accurate prior to like it going to someone that could like fail or cause issues?
Yeah, I mean, this is always tough, right? Because like, okay, so there's kind of different stages of the life cycle. There's at the beginning when we're first preparing a data or a new table or a new model, and like that's when everyone's really excited. People in the business or their stakeholders. You're like, hey, we just put together an initial data set. You get to show it to them. They get to look at it. You can do some, QA back and forth, and like everyone's really engaged. Like, yeah, the data is good, and you get that, kind of seal of approval, right? Then after that, we schedule the job and we move on to the next adventure. And we like, maybe we'll probably do some like input monitoring of like, hey, did the data stop flowing? Or do we see something that's really broken, right? I think the part when it gets a little bit more challenging is as the business evolves and maybe the systems that are feeding into it, we're no longer using, or now we're splitting traffic across like there's always a next gen platform, whatever the next gen platform or product is. And we start seeing the river run dry. That's when we might start seeing like changes to that picture of that information. And that can be a lot harder to detect because in that time, people change jobs. They don't know about the dashboard anymore. Maybe they're not using it anymore, right? And even having like different data engineering or analytics teams are structured differently, but even having usage metrics on how data is being consumed, like that, it's weird. quality matters if someone's looking. Quality
Yeah.
doesn't matter if no one's consuming it. And this is part of that like kind of work smarter, not harder thing of like, it's worth it to make those investments to get who's accessing what information, what's happening here, so that you can see what to deprecate or what might need more attention. If every day you know like your executive team is looking at these 5 dashboards, like you should probably know that those are the dashboards that need to be right and what all those sources are and that lineage, right? And be ready with that.
Just curious, do you have any tools that you use both for lineage, since you brought that up, but also quality, or is that all in-house?
Right now it's all in-house. I'm working on, with the team on like bringing on those tools. We're in our own journey, and right now we're really like changing our processing platforms and organizing a lot of our approaches to how we're computing our data. But we're going to graduate into quality in not so long. Our lineage right now is actually pretty straightforward, so we have a pretty easy grasp on that. Part of the virtues of not being a big application system, we don't have 500 tables that represent a web app or mobile app that we have to integrate plus 50 log streams. Like we are having very well-defined sets of data we pull in.
Yeah, I think just again thinking back to my experience, that was like the one I think it's like, look, we need like 5 entities. That's all we need from you guys. We don't need 100, and then we can define it. There was obviously always some, like you said, standardization, because like everyone has slightly different columns, and we weren't big enough to tell people how to make it. We tried. We're like, can you give us this, a CSV that looks like this? So like, nah, here's our CSV. Okay, we'll fix it. We'll make it work. So
that being said, like, it's on my LinkedIn. Like, I'm an investor in Big Eye, Big Eye Data. Love them. I mean, the 2 founders, I worked with them at Uber. One of them I worked through 3 different jobs, like through his career. And a lot of that product was based on a lot of the challenges we face around data quality, of like knowing or being able to tell someone when their dashboard's out of date because something broke, further back in the pipeline, where your reporting tool and your ETL is not really connected in a meaningful way.
Yeah, no, Big Eye solid. I think the funny thing I learned this weekend, for some reason I didn't know that data fold was lift, and so I was like, so the enemy, the whatever you want to call it, the animus continues lift versus Big Eye, or data fold versus Big Eye.
I think I would look at it more as like the trauma was shared, and so it didn't matter where you are, we all have the same challenges.
Yes, that was. I think I posted something about like data horror stories the other day, and Gleb, I think it's Gleb, from Datafold posted, and he's like, the reason I built Datafold was because the trauma from Lyft and the problems I caused at Lyft due to my my data. So that's all.
Trauma is what unites all data engineers.
I mean, like data quality issues, like, and I don't want to, like, obviously this is where we're going from, like data. The funny thing is, like building data products, like data quality is so huge. It's just like, but I don't want to make this all about that. But yeah, it's like, it's so unavoidable because there are so many ways data goes wrong. It's like, well, data can functionally work. Your pipeline can perfectly work and push data through. But for some reason, a column was off, something happened, someone didn't include a column, like, especially when you're taking it from someone else, right? Like, I don't know how you're processing it, but when you're taking it from someone else, a new person sending the file, they didn't know there was a query, they just sent you whatever file, a column is off, and now you take it in, maybe you checked it, I don't know if you've, maybe you're not checking the names, and you insert it, and it's still a varchar, so it worked, and then it goes through, and it's like, oh, that's not the right column.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's always funny. I guess what lessons kind of would you take throughout this whole process of kind of building externally facing data products to companies that are like, if you were to re-challenge yourself to do internal data products?
Sorry, say that one more. So what?
Yeah.
Now that I'm building products that we're selling to others, what are some of the techniques or skills or like experiences that I would take back to a company where we're doing it internally?
Yes.
Right?
Sorry.
Okay.
I
was a
weird.
complicated question. No, it's good. I feel like it's the opposite. I feel like, I think this speaks to some of the, we shouldn't obsess over trauma here, even though it's sad, funny, it's like not too great. But like, when you do have like tons of internal stakeholders, you have tons of internal sources, and there's so much motion and so many things that can change or break or have challenges to keep things going in the platform. I think like in all of that challenge that we have really is valuable. And I think that was my point of like the means to the ends. I think for many folks, it can feel really undervalued that like, I know this from like, doing many different engineering career paths and career ladders. A lot of software engineers sometimes feel like what data engineers are doing isn't that hard because all you're doing is writing SQL queries, which, by the way, they all hate writing and don't know SQL and yet act like it's not hard. And I'm like, oh, okay, sure. But like, you have to understand how not just 1 or 2 systems work, but how many systems work at an extremely high level of detail. and how to correlate all this information, right?
Yeah.
And I think by going through those experiences of being able to handle a high volume of literally information and knowledge that you have to maintain about all these systems in order to produce a product that people internally find valuable prepares you really well for moving in to a productized data space, right?
Yeah.
Like you do care about quality because you have an incentive. You don't want someone being upset or waking you up, or as you said, slacking you that this thing is wrong, right?
Yeah.
And so taking those fundamentals and having the space and priority to really harden and invest in them really actually I think takes it to the next level when you're working on a product, as opposed to the other way around.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just stuck on the part on the SQL part. I'm working on an article with Gergely from another Uber Gergely, and he's like, one of the questions he asked is like, yeah, like it's just like, what is data engineering? And he asked the question like, oh well, what would you tell a software engineer they should learn? And I'm like, SQL, because whenever I work with a software engineer, it's like SQL. How to like I know it's only like 10 clauses. I get it. It's not like this complex thing, but the thing is it's not the SQL that is complicated. It's not the language. It's the data and how you deal with it, and that gets really messy really fast, and it's just really easy to make a mess.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like I will say, like I was that software engineer who was like, write SQL, I don't want to write SQL. Like it feels like kind of beneath me. In truth, at the time, it was like I don't really know how to approach this language and this is what I hear all the time. Because it doesn't have imperative constructs, because I can't write a for loop, or because I can't think about it one row at a time, and it's doing it for me, it makes me feel like I don't have control in that system. Whereas like it took me a while before I understood like the way when I teach other folks SQL, I'm like, there are 4 operators you need to understand, right? It's like you have to understand how a join works, which is the hardest part, which is not that hard, but it's significantly hard, right? You have to understand how a filter works, a where clause, or whatever your language for it is. You have to understand how to aggregate things, and you have to understand to say what you want, right? And I think a lot of the imperative, like, math or logic ends up being in like the select statement of just like, what are those columns with that logic?
Yeah.
But people tend to approach writing queries from select and then what they want. As opposed, I tend to start writing my queries first from the join. I say, what are the data sets I need? Put that together, and then you start layering it out. And I think the way we teach SQL is from left to right, when we should be teaching it from like the order of operations that the database actually performs it in, because it's more intuitive for how like a lot of people write software or might think about solving the problem themselves.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. Also, for anyone who's watching currently, feel free to put some Q&A to go. We'll keep kind of talking until I see some questions going. But yeah, I think like just thinking about like SQL, like my very first problem was more just like the trying to solve everything in one query problem, right? Like it's like, oh, I've got to clearly have like 4 populations here that I'm going to be looking at. Let me do it all in one query. I can do this. I can do this. And like you have 1,000 lines, and it's like someone looks at this and they're like, do you remember what you did? Like, no, not at all. And then you start breaking down, and you're like, okay, I got to do like CTEs or something, or some sort of breakdown to make sure it's like, okay, this is population A, this is population B, this is how you want to join the two. You want to figure out the difference or whatever it is. It's pretty straightforward when you think about it that way. But like when you initially start, you're just like, let me just write one query. I can do this in one.
I mean, that's why I think tools like DBT that help you just structure a series of queries, but not feel like you have to now maintain a whole other infrastructure to run a set of calculations, are actually like really effective at helping you kind of keep it clean as a SQL developer.
Yeah. I think everyone I've talked to in terms of like DBT or data pipelines recently, like they're all like, yeah, our company built something that was DBT like at some point. So it's like everyone's built it. It's just a thing now. I think I worked at a company where we built it via PowerShell. I just came in and it's like, so we use this thing. You just tell it, you configure what your query is, and then tell it to go. And you're like, oh, okay. So it's very funny when it's like, that's all it really is. That was all Facebook. I tell most people what it was. It's like, all it was parameterized SQL telling it when to run. Like we just told it when to run, and it ran. Which some people hate because it's like, we want to code.
Cron and Bash. We like at one job we started with Cron and Bash. We then moved up to Jenkins and Bash, and then we actually started using Clojure to write queries. So it was Jenkins and Clojure. It's like we just kept layering on different tools to like just automate a DAG, really.
Yeah. I'm curious. Do you have anything? Do you have any thoughts in terms of like execution plans? Someone's curious about query execution plans. What are the key aspects to understand of explain and plan?
Yeah. I guess I'll say it probably depends on your database, right? Is it
Yes.
columnar store or row-based storage? I'm willing to guess it's probably row-based storage, just because most often, if you're using Postgres or MySQL, or the most common, or SQL Server, tend to be the most common row-based storage. It's funny when people say, "Hey, is a computer science background really that important?" A lot of times it's not, but sometimes when you're looking at like the internals of what's happening, being able, as you read the execution plan, to build some kind of like intuition. Again, what's happening with the data? When it says it's doing a hash join, what is a hash join versus a merge join? What is true about your data? And what does the database need to know about the data in order to make those assertions? A merge join would need to know if the things are sorted. It would need to know what the layout is on disk. A hash join needs to know, hey, like, is that index going to be very, very, I forgot the right word, but like articulate? Like, well, there's a high number of distinct values, or is it going to be pretty low? Like, there's all these like small considerations. That's like, do I understand what a hash map is versus a merge sort, kind of thing? It's like there's all these different nuances.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like you start seeing that, you start seeing like table scans, you start seeing like index scans. You're like, oh, okay, this is like what's actually going on underneath the hood. And in terms of like when you're trying to tune performance, it's all about those little things like, okay, do you need an index here? Maybe it's already doing an index scan. That's not the problem. Like you said, maybe the join is the problem where the issue is. Like you also brought up, nowadays, it's like fun part is now there's like at least 4 or 5 key processing engines you're going to be looking at. So it's like, does Snowflake process it the same way as Redshift? That processes it the same way as Spark? Not really. So now it gets even more fun. Like I feel like it was easier when it was just like, like classic, Microsoft SQL, Oracle.
Well, now especially with like Redshift, Vertica's, and I'm familiar with Vertica, and Snowflake does this too. When you have a distributed database, like your data layout makes a huge difference. Your column encoding makes a huge difference on performance. Like all these they give you read these instruction manuals. It's like, here's 1,000 things you can change. And it can be really difficult to map out like just how am I storing my data in my table to how that impacts my query performance versus like, what can I change about my query to impact my query performance?
Yeah. You guys aren't very question and answer today. Usually, I always say like
because I was late, which I apologize. You're so sorry.
Yeah, the common questions I always end up getting are like, which cloud should I use? Which I always say like, doesn't really matter. You might use all 3 at one company. It's like but maybe start with AWS or Azure since they're learned more. But unless you want to do like a startup, then I feel like AWS is popular. Azure, I feel like it's more enterprisey. So that also just depends where you want to work. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to know who has the luxury to choose. Usually it's assigned to you upon showing up.
Yeah, it's never necessarily the one you think will be best. It's always like the CTO. Well, you're the CTO of your company, but like at a larger company is friends with Paul Allen, so you're using Azure or something like that. It's like, look, that's how it works. It
happens more than you think.
Well, that's what I always find interesting with like the solution world. It's like everyone, I think, assumes it's like best solution wins. It's like good enough solution plus distribution plus networks. It's
sometimes this is the first thing we found, and that's why we chose it, and that's fine.
Yes, there was a good article. We read it. It seemed to make sense. We picked it, and you're like, that was from the company that you bought it from. So
yeah.
All right. So here, what tips would you give to junior data person who is going to present in front of execs? I know you should have a POV of the business, the value, and avoid technical jargon. So any other tips there?
Yeah. And so I would say, forget that you're a junior data person. You're a person presenting to execs. Like I tell people, there's like kind of like 7 slides. That you should your presentation should be 7 slides, no more than 7 slides, absolute max, right? And I think the first slide you have up there is if you don't clearly state the problem, forget it. Yeah. And the reason I say this is half the time you'll walk into an executive presentation, and if not everyone in that room, despite the fact that they're on the executive leadership team, are on the same page about what the problem is. And you want to know that first before you continue talking. Because if there's disagreement about like what the real question here we're trying to answer is, or like what the information they want to see, and you can't frame that problem for them, like do not pass go, do not like engage and get going. The other thing too is they're usually going through many meetings back to back. If you don't set that context, the other thing I often see is like you're telling me a bunch of stuff and I have no idea why you're telling me this stuff because I've been in like 16 different conversations today. And like I think to respect yourself, you don't want to lose that moment that you have with them just because they wanted to be polite and not ask you, what are we talking about? Why do we care? Like remind them what the problem is, like how it's impacting the business first. Then go into your solution, right? So like if you're going to start saying like, hey, this is like the analysis, like why is our customer funnel not performing well, right? Mm-hmm. Then like in your analysis, you're probably gonna do some, like all the different phases of your funnel. Like you want to hone it in to like 1 to 3 key insights that you discovered from the data and just say what the insight is without any information, right? Because you're about to have a conversation and say, I have the answer to your problem, narrow it in, right? When you give them those 3 waypoints, then each of the next slides in your presentation, remember we said 7 slides, or 2 down, 1 slide on the first waypoint, what is that data or visual that's going to show them how you came to that conclusion? 1 slide on the next data point, 1 slide on the next data point. Now, if you're a good analyst or a data person, what you should do, maybe you and your boss, what is the next question they're going to ask? All the best data scientists and analysts I've worked with, they've already looked at the information and thought what my next 1 to 2 to 3 questions are, and they already have that answer. And if you can put it in that slide or put it as a follow-on, that is really effective so they know that you're thinking deeply about it, and it can help them identify what you maybe haven't thought about. And then that last slide is like what questions they have about the presentation. You don't have to belabor like the point, just be really articulate about the problem, the key insights, enough to support, just enough to get them going on it. You might get through half the presentation, and that's totally normal.
Yeah, I've definitely gone through my fair share of like, let me just put like you think more is more, so you're like, let me just put everything in this presentation, and then like they're like, then one, like you said, they'll stop on like slide 2, and if you haven't clearly explained things, they'll like ask 30 minutes worth of questions, and then if you haven't clearly stated either what you're talking about or what your conclusion or insights are early on, they just are like, well, I got like 30 other meetings, so I don't really know.
Sorry. The most important thing at the end, what do you need from them? So they may have come to you and said, like, we asked you this analysis, we want to know. And it's like, well, should I ask for something I need? You don't have to say like, well, I need this, but you can say, if you guys want to know more, maybe this is what we have to prioritize, or like, I would love to know if you want to know more so that we can dig in more. Make sure you have an ask at the end, or be really clear that like, I just need the next step from you guys or what direction.
Yeah, that makes sense. What is this? 1 sentence of advice. I don't know this. I'm trying to see if this is a question. 1 sentence of advice for me going into some interviews this week. Ben, you can skip. I've hit you with enough questions. Yeah. Do you have any advice for someone going into interviews this week?
Oh boy. Yeah. Well, so much interview advice. Yeah. I mean, there's so many kinds of aspects of the interview.
Yes.
So like, what's a typical interview panel look like? You're going to have some coding section, probably SQL and or Python. Maybe you have 2, right? I think I won't belabor it too much. There's a lot of coding interview tips out there. Here's what I'll say is probably the most non-obvious tip. Not everyone wants to talk all their thoughts out. If you need to like take a moment to think, which is totally fine, tell the interviewer, hey, I'm going to take a couple of minutes and sit in silence and ponder the problem. Because sometimes interviewers are very eager to help or give hints. And then they're like, well, I have to give the person a lot of hints. And you didn't need the hints. You just needed them to not talk. And you also needed to not talk. Yeah. And it's fine to tell them if you need space to think. Don't feel bad about it, right? I think when you get to an architecture round where it's like, hey, tell me about a system or like, let's design a system to solve this problem. Your experience is going to be the best source of your influence to a solution. You don't have to get to a perfect solution if you can highlight from your experience what decisions are bringing you to this.
Yeah.
Right. Sometimes you'll have interviewers that are looking for very specific answers. They tend to be a bit more junior in their interviewing experience, and that can be unfortunate. And if you don't line up to their answer, don't feel bad. Don't take it personally. Sometimes your interviewer isn't the best person to be interviewing you.
That's very true. Just I've had to give like 150 plus interviews. So plenty of interviews, plenty of bad ones that I probably gave where I was like, I'm just not giving the right advice. And yeah, just I do like that you said like make sure like tell them like if you need some moments just to think. Because I think some advice that's always out there is like, oh, make sure you talk through your solution. It's like if you can, like some people like I personally like I'm like, look, let me write this and then I'll tell you what I was thinking. Or like usually what I do is like frame the problem, like here's what I'm gonna do, like here's how I'm gonna join things. Does that sound about right? Then I do it, and then maybe if they still have questions, I'll add. But that's usually the process. And then I hope that if you have a good interviewer and you tell them something that was wrong, they hopefully will be like, does that sound right? Because I think I've had situations where I've seen people like not tell someone like, why didn't you just like, they told you what they were going to do and you could have saved them so much time rather than let them go down the wrong way.
Yeah,
like,
some interviewers are very picky about tests and they'll be like, well, they should have written tests. And then I'll ask those interviewers, did you tell them to write a test? And they'll be like, well, no, they should have known. And I'm like, how can someone read your mind? So as a good interviewee, if you're not sure if you should write tests, ask. Would you like me to write a unit test for this? Would you like me, and they can be like, yeah, sure, that would be great. They're like, no, you don't have to, because they might want to go on to another part of the question. So don't be afraid to ask, like, as you're going through what your interviewer may want to know.
Yeah. Luckily at Facebook, at least for the screening round, they had pre-written tests. So it was just like, just write it. It'll assert it for you. So that was always kind of nice. What is this question? Okay. Long questions. What are the key aspects you want to have clear during the first iteration of planning or design? I tend to find myself getting delayed because of unforeseen issues or questions I didn't ask early on. Okay, so it's like, yeah.
Love it. I love it. This is how trauma starts, people. This is exactly where we start our learning process. And I mean, I do want to actually say, like, I think at the end of your projects where there are these unforeseen or delayed things, this is actually really important, even if it's just for yourself. What were those questions in this project I could have asked? Because you'll start building up that library of how you should be thinking about the problems based on how your business operates. Because every place is a little bit different in terms of clarity of thought, clarity of ask, who's engaging with you in it. Mm-hmm. Always do a retro after any project you deliver about the design phase in particular. That's the phase that's going to prevent the cycle, right? Now, to me, when you're building tables or APIs, like something that serves or provides data to others for them to consume and use, mock out that API or that table early, quickly, however you can, so that people can start writing queries against it. The sooner you get them to write queries against it, it doesn't matter if there's no data in it. It doesn't matter if you put the table in the database with fake information that you handwrote yourself. The sooner you can bring people to tangibly touching the set of tables and interfaces that you're going to provide, the sooner you're going to get the most critical feedback, and you're going to get them to start talking through how they plan on integrating it into their system. And that's usually where most of like we didn't know we needed to actually do this with the data or that with the data, and that feedback will influence and adjust your design.
Yeah, definitely. It's always good to like, I don't know, put things out. Like I feel like as technical people, we want to like hold things in where it's like, no, it's not perfect yet. It's not the exact way we want it. We haven't designed it perfectly. It's like, well, it's when you figure out it's not perfect
is when you actually run the fucking query. That's when you know it's not perfect, right? And like I will have people in their design docs write queries, like sample queries that we would expect to run against this. If it's integration to an application, they can write their models of how they would represent the data and the kinds of updates or data lifecycle things. If it's for analytics, like what are the questions, what are the dashboards that you're going to build so that we can line up the right fields and attributes? And it may seem like a little tedious, but the data design, literally the schema, field names are super important. Do not hand wave anyone over a field name. That like constantly causes problems. Like get people to really nail it down and use writing example queries as a way to help them think through it.
I like the sample queries because like again, like I brought up earlier, like SQL is easy, but like the data is hard, and so like that forces you to think like, how would I use this? Like if I was going to create a metric off this data, how would I, based off this data model I'm putting together, is it possible? Can I even connect the data? Am I creating orphan data where it's like I can't even answer this question because there's no actual connection or ID here? I think that's always really important. Okay, I think this question is valid because I'm always curious, like good ways of doing things like this. So how can someone learn practice streaming in a non-production environment?
I am the worst person to ask about streaming. Okay, so let's talk about a long con. Like streaming is like a long con. Everyone's like, Streaming is going to solve all of our problems. It's so thrilling. It's so much fun. The data will be flowing. I'll have built this amazing system. It always starts this way. The first question I ask people is, what are the actual latency requirements for your data? Like, how up to date does the data truly need to be for your business to operate successfully? One of my most pedantic friends is like, I would be like, it's a real-time data system. And he's like, what's real-time about it? And I'd be like, what do you mean? It has to be really fast. We need up-to-the-minute information. It's like, but what business process or product requirement will break if there isn't a timing constraint that's met? If you don't have a timing constraint that actually has business value associated to it, fuck off on streaming. Like, you're just going down the wrong road because it feels really cool. It's not necessary. And that's when we start over-engineering our solutions. And here's why am I so like, whoa on streaming? What's really challenging about streaming data is when you change the query, you have to recompute everything, and that requires a batch system. And so I'm going to like even slow that down a little further. There's two ways to think about a database. It's a place where the data is fixed, right? I put all my data in this MySQL database, and I can write an arbitrary number of queries against that data. That is typically how we think about data. Another way to think about a database is a place to store a whole bunch of queries. There's a fixed number of queries. And as data moves through, it checks every query and sees if it aligns to it, and then flows to the right location. A streaming system is a database where the queries are fixed and the data is flowing through, which then means if I change the query or if I add a new query, the first question is, for those answers, do I need to reprocess any of the data and pass it all through? Or is it okay if the data is like only within a recency period or starts working forward, right? So what ends up happening is you start on a streaming system that you almost always certainly need to build a batch system in order to do backfills for anyway. Yeah. Okay, this is my soapbox. I will move on. How can you learn and practice streaming in a non-production environment? You can set up, I mean, there's so many tools on Amazon that you could spin up with like Kinesis and Redshift or Kinesis. And I mean, it just really depends on the problem you're solving. If you want to give me a more specific example, I'm happy to help.
Yeah. I feel like maybe the hard thing with streaming is like getting data that's flowing, right? Like it's like getting a data set that like actually creates stuff. I feel like it's almost easier when you're relying on software to be that data set that is a stream, right? Like you're just creating a consumer that is connected to their Kafka instance, right? Like it's already like they're managing it. You're just creating a little consumer that then essentially just pushes it, like you said, to like your data batch system, essentially. And I think that's often what can happen in a lot of companies. They have some sort of event management system that like pubs and subs. But also,
I think Spark streaming, if you're using Spark, it's a good way to play with a batch process and say, hey, if I want to take this batch Spark job and rewrite it as a streaming process, and maybe I have something where a file gets dropped off and it flows through, write something that notices the file and starts emitting it. I think that's a good way for you to look at the architecture side by side with maybe a batch process that already exists inside of a language where most of the logic is written, and you're focused more on the mechanics than rewriting the logic.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that is one nice thing with the Databricks. Like it was built with like streaming, not necessarily in mind, but just as a functional component of Spark. So that's kind of nice. Where Snowflake has it, it's a little harder. It's not native to Snowflake thinking. But that's just how that is. The funny thing is like your earlier point, I had like a conversation with a possible client that was like in 30 minutes, we went from we need real time, maybe every 15 minutes, maybe every hour. They're going to look at it like 3 times a week or once a week. So, it was like, okay, so in this 30 minutes, I've learned enough.
And like, here's the thing, if you build a batch system, you can always add a streaming one later. And this is why like understanding how people are using your product, like your work product, is really important because it helps be like, okay, do we really need to do this or not? Because like, if you want to be successful as a data engineer, you want to constantly be able to deliver for your team or for your organization. And so if you're not careful, you can be seduced by streaming. It is the siren on the ocean. So everyone is so excited about it, but so many ships crash there and products never get launched or they're unmaintainable.
Yeah, I think that's like one thing I was like slowly learning. Not the streaming part, but just like the thinking about like maintainable at Facebook. Like, because by the end, I think I was maintaining a few hundred pipelines, and I was like, I pretty much need to switch teams to like re-impact again because I am maintaining so many pipelines that I can't actually do real work. Because you're just managing all these other pipelines, and like someone changed something in every once in a while or something like that. So yeah, it's definitely I think it's interesting how much people again will read an article, they'll be like, this is the way to do it, and it's like, you're a 2-man 1-man team, you cannot support this. Like, you will not, like, maybe initially it'll be fun to build, but then like, okay, you build it, now you got to manage it, and then on top of that you have data requests coming in because you built it. How are you going to do both? Like, you can't.
Yeah.
Unless you don't sleep and enjoy working weekends, which is not my thing.
Yeah, for real.
Oh my god, that's too funny. Currently we're still seeing if there's any more questions, but yeah, let's see everyone. Oh, but someone said sports gambling great for streaming. Well, I mean, I'm sure there's some data sets out there. I think that is one nice thing about the current world of data. It's like there's just so much more data accessible for working on problems like this. Like, I remember like when I first started, I'd have to like download, MS SQL or something like that, then find some data, try to upload it. The data might be wonky, so it'd be weird. And now it's just like, oh, just go to BigQuery. They've got like a bunch of data sets you can use for free and ask all sorts of like interesting questions. Have you ever looked at Felipe Hoffa's stuff? I'm curious.
I haven't.
He worked at BigQuery, wrote a bunch of articles about like that, and then like now he works at Snowflake. It is the same thing, so I just find that very funny. It's like, they poached him to the other team. So
that's good. Yeah. I mean, now, with all the data marketplaces, it's like really nice that you don't have to go and hunt everything down and upload it. It's just ready to go.
Yeah. Do you have a preference in terms of processing engine or tools of that nature?
I like Redshift a lot.
Okay.
I mean, it's pretty easy. I like SQL. It's a good interface to prototype quickly on. Honestly, I've gotten really good at Google. I know it's going to sound dumb, but like I came up with a method to build data pipelines on Google Sheets out of necessity in a particular role I was in where we had no engineers and no time, and everything was already in Google Sheets. You can build a lot with Google Sheets. That's like kind of unholy, and it's a weird like Chrome is your distributed processing engine. So you just leave a bunch of tabs open and shit just keeps updating. It's like very bizarre.
Oh man, that sounds like the VBA days. It's like, yeah, you can just use VBA for everything. It's like, but should you?
Yeah, but even if like Google has a query function, it doesn't do joins.
Yes.
But if you get really disciplined, you just do join. You use a query and then a set of VLOOKUPs, and then you can have sheets that just cascade, and it's just like this beautiful Google subsidized calculation engine.
I see what you're saying. Okay, so it's just like it's free anyways, and Google's not charging you for it.
Pretty much.
That's pretty funny. That's pretty funny. Yes, but, well, compute's not that expensive, right? I mean, I don't know what data you're running off of. It's like,
if you don't want to like set up a credit card or account and you want to build something quickly for people, if they're already using Google Sheets and your source data is in Google Sheets, you can build a lot in terms of a data pipeline with some good, rails and rules.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So this is kind of interesting, only in terms of like metrics layers, kind of.
I know. And this is really important for businesses. I mean, this is where everyone struggles, right? Like when we succeed to our next level of failure, it's like we have our data under control, we have data coming in, and then we get to this, like, the problem is business definition. Yeah. When I first started at Uber in 2014, my team was trying to figure out what gross bookings was. Like, how was it calculated? And we found 16 definitions of gross bookings.
Of course.
And so it was like, which one's the right one? And like, if there's 16 definitions, there's at least 16 people that need to be put into a room to decide one. Yeah. And like, whew, that was a hot, steamy conversation. Like, it went on a long time, right?
Yeah.
I think defining metrics as a layer is very good because it's attempting to tackle that problem.
Yeah.
Right? Because like, it's really like, how do we define this so that we can build on top of it? This is where so many companies end up struggling.
Yeah.
I think if I was picking, like, if I had to go through and decide, like, who do I think would be a winner here? Show me the team that is creating a way to collaboratively manage the definition of those metrics. That's the complexity.
Yeah.
It's not defining the calculation. It's getting everyone to agree and have a change control process on it.
Yeah. Yeah. So like a, not a Google, like a Git, like some sort of Git repo of some kind that, it's like a YAML file with something or other.
Yes, that's like a technical implementation of how to
Yes,
do that.
yes.
I think it's like for your company, who are the human beings that need to be able to agree, and
Ah,
how can it help them understand what the definition is,
mm,
and then help them update it,
yeah,
right? So it's easy for you to like explain to them what the business logic is, and then update the platform as it evolves over time.
yeah.
That's really the big challenge. And a lot of times when these systems get built out, there'll be a fixed definition of that metric, and everyone's like, we're never going to change it. And then you're going to change it all the time, and that's
Yeah.
when it starts becoming challenging. And people start abandoning them.
Yeah, I think that's like, and I think even at Facebook we were trying to do this when I left. It's just, it is so hard because it's this people aspect that you never get rid of. I think I even brought that up before you got on, like the data lake versus data warehouse. I'm like, you're just getting rid of when logic is implemented, but it still needs to be implemented somewhere.
Yeah.
Like somewhere it's getting implemented. Same thing with the metrics layer, right? Like it's getting implemented at some point. The problem is then like, how do you get people to commit to it and then like try to stick with it for a period of time that makes sense? Because yes, there's always something to change. There's always, is that really what we meant? It's like, God dang it.
Or we have a new product line, or the business changes, or like the way we operate changes.
Yes.
You know, it's like, and I'd say like if you're in an early stage startup and you're trying to define a core set of metrics, fuck off. Like it's going to change every quarter, and it should. Like you guys should be trying to adapt your business.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
typically, data is like a uptown problem. After you're past the place where you have a product that's working for your business, that's when data starts becoming really compelling.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a great way of also looking at it. It's just like, you can't expect it to stay the same. I mean, it like you're gonna have it. Your software engineer is going to want to add a feature to it, and then that feature is going to change kind of how this metric's defined, and even a small like little tick box like just changes how everything kind of operates. That's always the fun about being data engineering. We're just the middle child. we're just gonna deal with what everyone else is thinking of, and like, oh, software did this, data science wants this. We got to make everyone happy in the middle. Okay, fine. Someone's asking, any blogs that you personally like for either data products or just data in general?
I'm more of a social learner. What I've enjoyed, ironically, is like going to conferences or going to meetups, especially when meetups pre-COVID times were really common. I think there's we said this earlier. There's so many tools that either have a lot of intersection with a lot of different problem spaces, or there's just so many tools out there. Being able to go and not only talk and learn about the tool, but learn about their intention and where they see the problem in the space going, I think is actually, for me, a more meaningful way to contextualize it. Not because blogs aren't effective, but I feel like you're always getting a glimpse into a part of the story, and it's hard to kind of see the whole thing from it. Then you go to their website, and then it's just all like corporate speak, and you're like, I don't even know what this does.
Yeah. No, do you feel like that's the same in terms of like building data? Like, say, I don't know if they meant data products in terms of like vendors or data products in terms of like something that you guys are doing where it's like an actual like.
Oh, I assumed it was vendors. Huh.
Yeah.
Not off the top of my head. Sorry.
No, I don't think there's a lot of companies or a lot of blogs that do specifically talking about here's how you build something that you can now like package and sell as a data product. Because I think like some people don't really consider what they do a data product, or it's just like, I don't know. It's also a very hard business. Like it's interesting because everyone asks like, if I were to do a startup, what would it be? And part of me wants to be like something like that, where it's like a pre-made data product that delivers value day one. I feel like often the challenge here is that people want the dream and they don't want the pre-made thing, in terms of like they want to build their own data warehouse where they're going to fail to deliver analytics on initially. And it's going to be really hard. It's going to be very expensive. And they don't want something that delivers value day one, because that limits, and it limits you on what you're going to deliver. And it's like, okay, you are now tied into whatever that functionality is, and it's not going to expand. So that's why it's like the market's always smaller than I wish it was. That's where I always feel. It's like it's a hard space, even though it shouldn't be, but it is. It's a very hard space, I feel like. I mean, and you guys, I hope, are doing better. That's why I left the company that I was doing with Healthcare Analytics. I was like, we're not going to go above a few $1 million. That's we were profitable, but
yeah.
What's next for data?
Of course, this is such a good question. I mean, it's true. It is a good question, right? Yeah. I think there's probably two different angles. Just coming off the last question of like, do we mean the data or do we mean the tooling?
Yeah.
I think in terms of tooling, what we're seeing is actually what I started talking about, which for me, this is like 15 years ago. I'm like, this is the problem, is like semantic management of information. Like, what does any of this mean? And how do we know that it still means what we think it means? I think like in the data quality space, Big Eye, I know there's a couple other friends who did some startups that are around like machine learning modeling, like integrity. Like, is the model still working in the way that we expect?
Yeah.
Being able to capture intent and make it easy to translate and make it systematic in terms of like, is it doing what we think it's doing? Have we been able to identify what we think we want it to do? And being able to do that so businesses can then iterate. I think in the tooling space, you're going to see a lot of companies who are working on how do we manage the semantics of information. A metrics API is like in that space. How do we start codifying semantics that we can evolve and build on top of it instead of being in the loop where we're constantly redefining it because we never defined it the first time? I think in terms of data itself as a product with the company I'm working at right now, I think what is enabling about having vendors that sell data is now if you want to build a product that needs to be like built on top of machine learning models, or that you need to like you want to have like a magical user experience with like autocomplete, or you want to be able to like have something where users are getting benefit from having your data enriched with more information or more context, you basically have to be Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Apple, someone who's tracking everything about you.
Yeah.
It creates this like large moat for anyone else to innovate and create personalized or meaningful products, unless you're one of these giant companies.
Yeah.
And that's where I think like the more data sources where we start seeing, standard interfaces, data being sold on marketplaces that allow, engineers and product folks to put together product concepts that don't require them to go and harvest everyone's data in order to do it, I think is really powerful and enabling for a lot of companies.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm curious to see if it like the execution is still the place I'm like trying to see will we do it. I like the intent part because ML models, that's always like the hard part, right? Like it's like I developed a thing. Is it still doing the thing you wanted it to do?
Is it degrading? Is it still a good prediction?
Yeah. Or is it now predicting things in a way you didn't expect it to predict? Like maybe it's accurate, but now it's predicting it in a way that you didn't want it to, in a weird way. Like it's now producing like an adverse ROI, a negative ROI, even if it's right. So like, oh, but now we're not really, we're spending more than we wanted to, or whatever.
I am rarely, but I can be convinced that it's better than a die roll, but no one ever does that test.
Yes, that would be interesting. Like you. So is that like your A/B test on how good your model is? You have one system that just like randomly generates a number between 1 and 10?
I honestly think it's really important to measure against uniform random because I think a lot of people out of pride don't want to, and they measure against like the existing product or product recommendation. But if you start comparing against random products, like that algorithm is cheaper, requires almost no data, and is very computationally efficient to do in real time.
Yeah, that's very funny. that'd be interesting to see how effective it was. But I wonder if that's in any experimentation platforms. Like if someone's implemented that option, it's like, here's a random.
So. I mean, you can it's so easy to implement.
Well, it's in theory, but I imagine for some people, then you have to build, because like most people don't even have like the systems to maybe implement practice or experimentation, not practice.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have an experimentation platform, but assuming you have one, implementing a random algorithm can be straightforward.
If you worked at Uber, Facebook, LinkedIn, etc., it's very easy. It is literally like, I mean, for us, it was a config. It wasn't even a configuration. You're just like, I built a model, push model here, test it this, some GUI drop downs, test it this way, gatekeeper setup, run against these people, we're done. So and other people are over here with like manually setting and pushing things, and they're like, man, they must be, I don't know. I feel like people think it's really hard. Like it is really hard at most of these big tech companies, but it's also in other ways very easy, right? Like it's hard, it's easy, it's both. You just have different problems.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is challenging as I moved back to startups, which I remember being in that originally, was when you're a data engineer at a large company, you're really focused on like whatever your data processing platform is, writing those jobs, using the frameworks that are there. When you're at a much earlier stage startup, like having a background where you're comfortable manipulating AWS configurations or setting up infrastructure, or even feeling comfortable in the command line and like working, to manage your Linux distro or whatever, however you're deploying it, is like a really valuable skill. And like not everyone has that background, and it really is important to be able to bootstrap in order to bring those new technologies in.
Yeah. Like I think a few weeks back, someone asked like, is DevOps skills important for a data engineer? And it's just like, well, If you work for Facebook, nope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
If you work for a small company, probably, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, you're the one who's going to be running all of, what, if you're doing Kubernetes, you're going to be running that. If, whatever you set things up, you're the one managing it. So yeah, it's just how the world is. So yeah. Well, we're getting pretty close here on time. I don't know if there's any last few questions. Do you have any questions for me? I'm just curious, Alex. You have anything for me on my side?
Yeah. I guess what are you most curious about? Like as you look at the data space, what do you think is next?
I mean, I have things I want to happen. Like I want like tools like Snowflake and Databricks and other things like that to just like become that like apps, like have that app store approach eventually where you can just like stick things on top of each other. Just because like, I do consulting in that space where like 30% of my consulting is just like, here's the solutions you should use. And I think it'd be great if it was just like, it was some buttons you clicked. You didn't have to go talk to a bunch of salespeople on 4 different companies. It was all just kind of done through Sales or Snowflake or Databricks, and just kind of move that away, and also well integrated, because that's the other thing that's like missing with all these components. It's like it's great that we've like made them really solid, because instead of having like one thing try to do everything, it's like, okay, this thing just does that and does it really well. But they don't talk to each other. And so now it's like, okay, you've got Big Eye, but it's not necessarily part of your process. It's not like part of your pipeline. And personally, it should be, right? Like it should be, okay, once this pipeline runs, now run all these checks, give me the output, now run this next pipeline, things like it, stop the pipeline if it fails. And all those things I think kind of get missed, because you have so many different disparate systems. And so, yeah, like a combination of like having one layer to manage it all, as well as like common integration points between all these solutions, I think will save companies a lot of money, because currently it's very expensive to put all this together just from a personnel standpoint. It's like you're gonna have to hire a lot of people just to manage the as one person I know likes to call it human middleware.
Yeah, it totally is.
It's just like, and you can't get around it currently. It's just like there's no really around it. You just kind of have to be, you're the glue. You're the person that makes sure all those things stick together. And it's like that doesn't seem efficient. So
I mean, if anything, I think that reinforces why this industry is probably going to be really critical for at least another decade. I mean, not at least, but you know what I mean? Like, this is a pretty good space to be in. It has a lot of complexity, and there's still a lot of space to move. I mean, in this, I feel like right now, people only in like larger companies are talking about GDPR and compliance.
Yeah.
I think over the next like decade, we're going to see a lot of architectures around how do you optimize for managing data requirements of like what you have to delete or what you have to be able to show audit-wise.
Yeah.
We'll probably see a lot there.
Yeah, definitely. Again, like it's one of those things, like you always see it like big tech, and then 5-10 years later you see it at other companies. Because we did set up a system that was basically like, here's how you like flag these fields like as you're building these pipelines. We also set up like ML models to then detect if those were like, be like, this field seems like it is, UII. Yep. Are you sure? You're gonna be the one that confirms that this is not UII. Exactly. Do you want to say yes? So it's like, well, which I think is always interesting, because sometimes you're like, I'm not really. I mean, is a username UII? Like, did they put their name into the username? Oh gosh, oh man.
Oh man, I know.
That's always interesting. Because like, if you did put the username, it's like your name in the username. It's like, well, technically now it kind of is. Thanks.
Yeah.
but how am I supposed to know? Because one person's flaming, underpants. You're Joe Smith, 1998.
Who's to say? Yeah, I know.
Thank you for putting all that PII. So, anyways, it's just funny. But yeah, I do think that's like a necessary thing, and it's really hard to deal with. It's a pain to like. I think it was, again, going back to my comment about like managing all these pipelines. Every 6 months, I'd have like 2 or 3 types of migrations that I have to deal with, which weren't always migrations. It's just be like sometimes like that, where it's like, implement this new thing into your pipelines that you already own. And it's like, oh God, I got to do 200 pipelines, this thing. And maybe you can automate some portions of it, but like some of it, you're just like, okay, fine. So anyways, awesome. That's always it. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Alex. I don't really have any other questions for you. And I think, this is probably a good point to stop. And I know, you probably got a busy rest of your night, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, guys. Thank you all. I'm going to say bye and hit end broadcast.